My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic multiverses. Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
And how would you rate that microscope? Ratings.
Are you implying that we're purchasing them online, so we have to leave ratings for the people who sold them to us?
No, more like rating things from 1 to 5, you know?
Oh, okay. Because, I have been doing a lot of online shopping lately, so I'm very familiar with the idea of rating, even like you have to, they ask you to rate the quality of your service, and I'm like, I don't know, I got my food, is that a 3-star service or a 5-star service? I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I've ordered food before where, they had a no-touch option where they would leave it at your door, and then you open your door and they look from afar as you take the food in. If you pay in advance, but then they didn't do that. They called and said, we're at the front door, so of the building instead of to the apartment door, which was what they were apparently supposed to do, but
Yeah, in my building, we've been told that we have to meet delivery people outside the building. We're not allowed to let them in or let them come straight to our unit. So yeah, the handful of times I've ordered food, it's kind of like a weird exchange where they're in their car at the side of the road and I'm basically leaning in and grabbing it out of their car. Almost it's an interesting experience, but hey, we are recording this episode ahead of time. So it's Easter right now for everybody who's listening to this. The Easter holidays are ongoing, and we're recording this episode ahead of time just so that we can fully enter into the experience of the Easter Triduum, even though we are physical distancing and we can't be physically close to the people we'd probably want to spend the time with. But we don't want to be podcasting, if you will, in the middle of a time we're supposed to be celebrating with other people. And I know for myself, my Easter celebrations will be very heavy use of Zoom and Facebook and FaceTime to at least visually and auditorially connecting to the people that I would normally spend time with. Yeah, so Beef Pork Ribs, hopefully you're doing well in the future as well as you're doing right now, which is the past, if that makes sense.
I should think so. Wait, are you asking if I'm doing well right now? Because then yes.
But you don't know if you're doing well when this goes out.
I should expect I would be. We are making plans. I'm probably going to sing with my niece and nephews via some kind of Skype or whatever. So yeah, I'm pretty excited.
I've been using Zoom a lot for video calls, and there's part of me that always thinks Zoom is a bad thing because Professor Zoom is one of the Flash's archenemies. So it's taking me a while. I'm starting to associate Zoom in a positive way because I really like Zoom as a video conferencing platform, but I still always think that it's a bad thing first.
Mm-hmm. I might have to start using it for my job soon, so we'll see how that goes. But I have enjoyed the couple of uses I've had of it.
Well, BPR, we are here at the end, the final episode of our Memory Lane series.
So dramatic.
It's just it's kind of interesting to see how this has gone along, because as people who have been following us through each episode will recall, I kind of proposed this idea to Beef Pork Ribs as a necessity because I was participating in a program called Exodus 90, where you fast from all TV, movies, and unnecessary web browsing, which would include all the news and updates about nerd and geek culture that I would be receiving. So, memory lane as a concept really came out of a way for us to continue doing the podcast in a season where I wasn't consuming new media. And it just sort of happened that this was all coming about right at the start of a new decade. So, it worked well to reflect upon the previous decade. And it has been quite the journey we've been on the last 10 episodes, 11, I think, because we split up one of the years.
Oh yes, we did.
Several weeks of going through the same kind of topics year after year. And this is kind of gonna be like our decade in review episode, kind of like looking back on the last decade as a whole, having spent time each year going through each of the specific years. We're now kind of talking about the decade as a whole. So if you have not been listening to the Batch Hour podcast recently, I would recommend going back and listening to our other episodes of the Memory Lane series, starting with our look at nerd and geek culture from 2010, and then continue all the way until the episode that came out last week about 2019, and then come back to this episode because we're really going to kind of give away, I guess, spoilers for each of the each of the things we talked about in those episodes. So for the sake of your enjoyment, we should encourage you to go back and listen to all of those before you listen to this one. Right, BPR?
I think that would be a wise thing to do. I mean, that's what I did in preparation. I went through our notes. I didn't re-listen to all of our last 10 episodes, but I went through all of our notes for the last 10 episodes and took notes of that and then constructed what I would say more or less efficiently from there.
So when Memory Lane was started as a mini series, we kind of broke it out into four main categories: video games, TV shows, anime, and movies. And those were the four categories we've had every episode of Memory Lane. And within each of those categories, the numbers we were tracking and the types of information we were tracking kind of changed as the decade went along. Had a lot to do with the advancement of technology in certain areas, which we'll of course talk about this episode. And I think it only makes sense for us to, as we reflect upon the decade as a whole, to still think in those four categories, to focus on discussion each of those areas. And then maybe if there's anything at the end that really sticks out to us as general for the whole decade for all nerd and geek culture, we can talk about it then. Here we go. Starting, of course, as we did every episode in this series, talking about video games.
Welcome to Talking Video Games.
Every week that we did a Memory Lane episode, we kind of talked about what were the top selling video games of the year. What were the video games that made the most money, sold the most copies, had the largest kind of broad appeal. But BPR, you were very good at kind of reminding us that the video game world changed a lot during this decade. So maybe if you want to just kind of touch upon some of those major changes that happened before we get talking about specific games.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest one is kind of the advent of Steam. For those who live under a rock and don't know what Steam is, uh, it's a service to download different games onto your computer, and you get your entire game library. You can add your friends onto it so they can see what games you're playing. It used to be a small service that basically only existed because uh, it had produced a few good games that people really like, but as it's gone on, it's basically become the platform for people to buy their games, and a lot of other producers will still kind of create, have the games available on Steam or through Steam to download them because it just becomes so much more convenient. And also, I think um, one of the big things as well is that esports becoming. I didn't talk about it that much, but I do think it has really influenced kind of gaming culture. Was esports becoming more of a thing because yeah, it was something that really spiked up. I feel the popularity of certain games. For example, like League of Legends that started. The other cool thing I personally want to talk about for video games is something I think I mentioned a few times, but it's called Games Done Quick, which is like video game speedrunning marathon, which also started gaining a lot more popularity. It started in 2010, um, and the last main event was actually a special event that they did, which was on February 29th, which was specifically to they're speed running marathons. So basically, you play video games, try to beat them as quickly as possible, and it's a 24-hour stream for a week, and people donate money for different charities. And I think it's helped to kind of take away from the image that gaming culture is all a bunch of nerds sitting around getting fat like they're represented in South Park and other media, but it is really something that is a large community and people are starting to kind of affect that. And in fact, the latest marathon was uh, a, a relief, was a fundraiser for relief for the coronavirus pandemic. So it's cool to see that what these kind of events have done, and they went from you know getting uh, a few $1,000s to getting millions raised over a week, which is incredible. I think.
Yeah, I mean, when we started doing Memory Lane, we talked about just physical sales of video games, and you were quick to point out that as the decade went on, there was more and more independently developed video games that were popular, and more people downloading their video games instead of buying physical copies, and platforms like Steam that allowed people to just download games right onto their computer, or even the advent of Twitch as a streaming service where people could watch other people playing all these kind of independently developed video games. It really helped broaden gaming culture beyond like what you're describing as kind of like what was, I guess, the perception of gaming culture. And
Yeah,
it's it's
and
it's yeah, it's interesting as we got towards the end of the decade, we saw more and more of the video games that people were playing a lot of were ones that weren't necessarily the ones that were being sold a lot.
a lot of them stayed on that list because the other thing that I didn't really talk about is downloadable content or DLC, where a game can be released one year, and instead of having to release a brand new game the next year, they can add expansions or add more content, that can just be added. Which again, Steam helps because you've already downloaded the game instead of buying a physical copy, and so you can just add more to it by downloading more of it, and that's definitely something that's been went from being something cool that, like, I remember when games used to have expansion. It's like you buy a new CD and you have to have the original game installed, then you install this, and somehow it's meant to reorganize the files. But now it's like, oh yeah, I'd like an expansion for this game. It came out 2 months ago. I'm gonna download it, and voila, I'm ready to play. So we've gone a long way that way.
So in terms of like video games that were influential and consistently on our top selling list, I kind of put together a list of games that were commonly popping up, like things we were talking about quite a bit. And for each category of video games and whatnot, we're gonna go through about five or so of the things that popped up a lot, things that were very popular, and then both BPR and I kind of came up with our own lists of top five for the decade. So we're gonna talk about the ones that showed up a lot on the list, and then we'll get into our personal favorites. So first of all, I put Minecraft on the list of video games we talked about a lot because it did show up in the best-selling video games list twice, and I believe it was in like the most played list somewhere once. And I remember this being significant because you mentioned how it was kind of released by accident initially, and then it still became a successful, like it was initially released for free or something.
Yeah, and people still loved it, and I think also you can't underestimate how much um, kind of influenced other games. Like, there's a lot of games that are kind of spin-offs of that or that have a similar vibe to them, like Terraria, which is basically a 2D version of Minecraft. There's a number of other games that, even though they're about something like a game I really love, 7 Days to Die, it is a zombie apocalypse survival game, but you still have to gather materials and craft certain things in your menu, and you need different, you need to craft a workbench to craft more harder items, and the kind of like the feel of that is something that it has definitely popularized and influenced many other games. So Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the early examples I can think of from the past decade of a video game being like kind of playable for people of all ages, really kind of breaking into like general pop culture. So someone like myself who does not play video games very often was very much aware of what Minecraft was because it became so pervasive. Like it was, you couldn't go anywhere without seeing it. So I think we got to give it a bat cookie, right?
Oh yeah, definitely a bad cookie on that.
Red Dead Redemption. The first game came out at the start of the decade and was on the top selling list. And then the second game came out in 2018 and was the highest best selling game of that year. One of very few titles to actually be the top selling game of the year outside of a certain franchise we're going to talk about very soon. And I think for that acclaim alone, for actually beating out a particular gaming franchise as top selling game, I feel like it's noteworthy for the decade.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And for kind of bringing whoops, a something a little more original to yeah, something original to the list, but also something that lasted like, people talked about them for a while.
So, Bat
That
Cookie.
cookie. Yes.
Grand Theft Auto 5. This game was originally released in 2013, was the highest best selling game of that year, and continued to be in the top selling video game list for like 4 years after that. And it was on like most played lists, like for Steam. And in the similar way that Red Dead Redemption was one of the only non a certain shooting game to be the best selling video game, I'm while I don't really enjoy Grand Theft Auto as an idea and or as a video game, it is incredibly impressive that a game that was released in 2013 continued to be a top seller for like 4 years in a row.
Yeah, I think definitely part of that was DLC, but also like we talked about it a lot. Like I don't personally like this game at all, and I think that it raises some problematic issues, less so than some other games perhaps, but more so than the average. Um, I think a lot of things we have in our top five though is there because there is something to it. Because there's something I think for Grand Theft Auto was definitely the freedom of that game where you could do anything, and also it was a game that very much allowed and encouraged players to add mods to it to make the game a little different. So I think it's still, as much as I don't like the game personally, I'd still give it a bat cookie for its accomplishment and the fact that yeah, it did stay up at the top five for a few years, and because ultimately, like it or not, and we could debate on whether this is a good or a bad thing. It is a very good escapist game.
Yeah, I'll give it a two finger bat nuggy. I don't want to completely give it a bat nuggy because it has some accomplishments to its name. So I admit it has merit, but not enough for me to actually give it a cookie.
Fair enough.
We saw every year at least two, sometimes three EA sports games showing up in the top 10.
Yep.
Soccer, basketball, and football were all very popular games. Initially, it was football was leading the edge, and the occasional time we looked at a globalist, soccer was better selling than either basketball or football. And then towards the end of the decade, we saw that basketball started to outsell football. So, you know, I have not really played any of these sports games, but it was incredible to see year after year consistently that these games were selling well.
Yeah, and I think we did talk about it. I think you did kind of hit the nail on the head that it is a lot about having the new players who were drafted every year. Especially, I feel like if we went back and looked at it, it's possible we'd look at, oh well, this is a year that this professional athlete started playing, or this one. Like I'm sure when Connor McDavid became available for the NHL games, they sold better that year. Um, Although hockey never beat any of the other sports. We did see it on the list. But I do know people who, big hockey fans, they buy the new NHL game every year. So, again, the accomplishments are great, but I feel like generally there's a bat noogie there because I feel like it's not necessary to do that. And again, we talked about it. Why don't they just add a DLC to get the new players in?
Yeah, and I think it maybe speaks to the how like there's different types of gamers. Like there's these sports gamers that will play sports games and buy new sports games every year, but they probably won't play other kinds of video games. We're there. Maybe there's something to be said about that. That like video gaming as one giant cluster might not be that valid of a grouping because there might be these different groups of people who play these different kinds of games.
Yeah, and I mean even within, yeah, you do have a lot of people who try to make those distinctions. I mean, there's the very broad distinction of like pros versus casuals, or like serious gamers they call themselves sometimes, and like I think there's definitely something to be said about there being a gaming community at large, but um, yeah, it would be foolish to kind of always regard all of them in the same way, which is why we kind of talked about video games, not video game community, or something maybe a little more specific.
I'll give these EA Sports games a back cookie overall.
I think, yeah, two fingered bat noogie. It's I can acknowledge they've done great things, but I also think they're problematic for other reasons.
We've kind of alluded to it at least twice here. Call of Duty.
Contact! Your clock!
Front lines are history. The war rages everywhere. This is a time for heroes. A time for legends.
Drop it!
Ace, this belongs to you, sir.
Let's get to work.
As a franchise, consistently was among the top selling video games. There were only 2 years in the past decade where a Call of Duty title was not the highest selling video game. And in those years, Call of Duty was like maybe second. It's not like they completely dropped off the map. They were still very close to the top. And there were even some years where the Call of Duty title from the previous year would slip into the top 10, like in like seventh or eighth place, even though
Yeah,
there's another Call of Duty that came out on top. We've discovered that there's like 3 or 4 different kind of sub franchises within Call of Duty. There were I didn't know that they'd made 4 different Black Ops games. I didn't know
I
that they'd
know,
done.
right? It's ridiculous.
Well, and the other thing too is that like it seems that like the numbers I was looking at suggest that like general physical sales of video games were kind of like starting to trail off towards the end of the decade, and some of the Call of Duty titles that finished in first place weren't received well critically. So people like some of the games maybe that didn't weren't as air quotes good a game, but it still had a large enough audience of people willing to go out and buy the thing or download it that Call of Duty consistently was the best selling video game series.
Yeah, and I I'm still giving it a bat a a one knuckle bat noogie. I mean, I can't deny that it's great, but unlike all the other games, I still don't understand why it did so well. Like, I think all the other games were like, I don't necessarily like this type of game, but I can understand why it did well. Call of Duty, not so much. I'm like, I don't understand why people would love it that much.
Yeah, from what I've been told, there's like the focus on multiplayer and being able to play with your friends, and the kind of bonus modes like zombies and whatever, like bring it like a whole nother element of enjoyment for people. So while I don't like shooting games in general, I've never been good at them, and I don't like Call of Duty personally either. I can't deny the continued success of this series, so I will give it a thin-sation back cookie. And then for ourselves, I thought it'd be fun, BPR. We could go back and forth, kind of mentioning video games that we put in our like top 5 of the decade. So why don't you go first and talk about one of the games from your list?
All right. Well, I'll start. I'll start from the top instead of the bottom because I want to keep that one for last. But I put Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild as um, in my opinion, the best video game that's come out this decade. Um, I don't think it's an overly controversial idea because like I think it was very good in the sense that it advanced a franchise that was pre-existing. It kind of threw the Nintendo Switch, which I think is a great console, into the mainstream. It was it combined both all the great things about being kind of an adventure game, along with such good mechanics for open world concepts. And like I've seen people spend hours and hours playing it without getting bored, without having the feeling that you're redoing the same thing over and over again. At least not too much. Sometimes a little bit, because one of the people I watch play it is a completionist, so he redid certain things over and over again. But I still think it was definitely a game that came in and kind of changed the way people looked at games. So that's why I have it, yeah, as my number one for new video games. It's a weird thing for these lists because some of them are definitely my favorites are at number one. Others I'm just like, no, this deserves to be higher up or high up for one reason or another. But I think Breath of the Wild is a bit of a mix of both. I did do very much enjoy it, and I think it's done great things, and it's just a gorgeous game.
Yeah, I definitely didn't like rank mine first. I just wanted to have five for each one. So the
Okay.
first the first one I wrote down was Super Smash Bros. For the Wii U, and that was mainly because this was really the only video game this decade that I was super invested in. Like from the time it was announced, I actually like got this console just so I could play this game, and I was just super hyped about everything they were doing, expanding the cast of characters, letting you play with 8 people at once, allowing you to retroactively add your GameCube controllers to the Wii U console. I just really enjoyed it, and I got a lot of good times with friends out of that game. So
Yeah,
that's
I
why
mean,
I put it on there.
Nintendo know what they're doing. Let's be honest. They might not be selling all of the games as much as other people, but this was, yeah, these were the two Nintendo games, I guess, Super Smash Bros. And Breath of the Wild, that did make it into the top five bestsellers at some point or other. So I think that's pretty telling of their quality.
All right, and what's another one of your games?
All right. The second one, I'm not going to talk about it too much, so it'll go a little quickly, but it was Minecraft as well. uh, as well. It was Minecraft, which I've talked about. Like the reason why I have Minecraft is because it is very much a, it's something that, uh, yeah, kind of spurned. I don't know, birthed different other games that were kind of a sideways look at it. But it also like, yeah, it was a game that was, when I say sideways, I mean like spin-offs. Basically, it created other games that were similar to it, and they were all games that were very user friendly, very open world, very like anybody could do whatever they wanted in them. And I very much appreciate that kind of opened up, you know, a place for creativity to come out in a very purposeful way, which is something video games used to get blamed for a lot, and rightfully so in some cases, maybe. But it was always like, oh well, they're killing your imagination because you're not making anything up. But then it was like Minecraft was literally all about what can I build in this world. It wasn't there wasn't a purpose. So you're not trying to beat the game or trying to get to a certain X amount of achievement or whatever. You're just doing whatever you want for fun. And I think that's definitely something that was needed.
I put Doki Doki Literature Club on my list. Not because I played this game, but because I thought it was really interesting how this independently developed video game created this kind of like internet culture, this whole like meme base, this whole kind of community of people who knew what the game was about. Uh, I think it's cool when a video game could do something like that, and I thought it was impressively done well in that instance.
Yeah, I like that too. I mean, I enjoy that game. I was actually, I'll go to my number four because, yeah, they weren't super in order. I was actually going between Doki Doki and Cuphead to talk about, as well as Undertale. The three of them kind of work together for the same reason that they were something new and they were something that kind of made a community work through. I think that like the YouTube community definitely loved both Doki Doki Literature Club and Undertale for what the kind of different ways to play through it. Uh, Almost every Let's Player played it, but I put Cuphead on this list because it's just so, like, again, like Breath of the Wild, it's a gorgeous game. It's something that's so unusual that it became a big thing, but that I'm so glad it did, because it is. like all 50s style animation for the entire game, and it's a game that has a very kind of old timey plot to it, and it was simple but like enough, you know, but it was a simple game, but that was polished so well, even though it was an indie game, and I think that's something to me that I found really impressive was just how well polished the animation was. The soundtrack was well looked into. Like every aspect of it took forever to make, but they made something of great quality without having necessarily a huge team and multi-million dollar budget behind it. I'm not sure if video games have multi-million dollar budget. They definitely do spend a lot of money on them. So whenever indie games can make something so beautiful and so well polished, I think it deserves recognition.
I put Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions on my list. This was again one of the only video games I actually purchased and played mostly through in the decade because again, I'm not a gamer, but this game had me intrigued. They had four different Spider-Man with different abilities, and they even got four different actors who had played Spider-Man in different animated shows come back to play the different Spider-Man in the game. So it did a lot for like the Spider-Man fan in me, and it kind of introduced me to this larger Spider-Verse, which uh, we'll talk about later.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. I don't know why. I also put Super Smash Brothers, the one for the Switch, though the most recent one, because uh, for a lot of the same reasons you put Super Smash Bros. For the Wii U, but also because I think it's a game that keeps on giving. Again, because of DLC, they add new characters. They've been expanding the franchise beyond just like the classic Nintendo games. It's really becoming more and more a Nintendo centric celebration of video games and a lot of vintage games, and I think that's really cool. But even though it is old, they've added some of the kind of newer, acknowledging newer games. And again, one of the characters is from Undertale, and that's a video game that almost nobody knew. And if it was just a game that came out every couple of years, or the next time Nintendo does a new console, and they just left it at left it at that. Sorry, you wouldn't have Sans, a character from Undertale, in it because nobody knew what Undertale was. And so I think it's really cool that Nintendo is giving kind of this approach to it that's not just you know looking at itself, but recognizing that there is a greater, in a certain way, unity almost within again the gaming community. But I mean like people who play video games who have kind of this attachment to nerd and geek culture as opposed to just catering to the Nintendo fanboys.
I put The Last of Us on my list, not because I've played this game, but because I feel like The Last of Us kind of symbolizes this approach to telling video games with motion capture acting and like telling a really good story. And I feel like The Last of Us was like one of many games that did this, where they like filmed actors and did motion capture so that they looked the sprites in the video game looked really realistic, and you were actually more interested in the video game for the story than the actual gameplay at times. But I think that's just an interesting trend of the last decade that is worth noting.
Yeah, I like that. And my last one was League of Legends, even though we did not really talk about it in the podcast, and it's older. It started before the decade started. Again, it's a game that has changed itself and that has become a bigger, more global phenomenon since. And I think it's something to recognize that a single game, um, you know, went from being having a few, like at the beginning of the decade there were like a few tournaments of League of Legends may have existed, but now there are several different organized leagues. There's a world championship every year. There is just an entire infrastructure built around one game, and a company that really just had one game. I think is super impressive. And also uh, personally, I love League of Legends. I still play it, and I've kept playing it throughout the decade. It's the game I've played the most, so I felt like I had to kind of talk about it and put it up there. Um, and you could just as easily mention Dota 2 there for similar reasons. I do think League of Legends has accomplished more, and a lot of those accomplishments have fallen in the last decade, even though the game started a little bit earlier.
And then the last video game I put in my top 5 was Overwatch. Again, not because I've played this game. I just feel like when it came out, it really was this explosion of like, here's this new video game that is not based on anything that already exists, with this large cast of colorful and unique characters, which really had an impact on pop culture. Like, one of the characters from Overwatch made a cameo appearance in the Ready Player One movie. I feel like Overwatch is a representation of, the fact that there are still new things happening in video games, even though the things that seem to be doing really well are part of existing franchises. Overwatch kind of represents the kind of like occasional bit of originality and creativity that we saw in video games.
I like that a lot, actually, that aspect of it. So yeah, it's I think it's a good place also to kind of end our list on, because I feel like a lot of the things, if you go and rewatch the episodes or listen to them, a lot of it was us repeating the same thing, which is part of why we started looking at indie games, because like every year it was a couple of EA Sports, a Call of Duty, and maybe something else, and then being able to appreciate that there is more to just that in video games. And yeah, Overwatch, especially because it was a Blizzard game that wasn't relying on pre-existing property like Dota or even Hearthstone, which both are based on the Warcraft and World of Warcraft games that they already had.
So moving on now to TV shows. I think in general, as we started talking about TV from the decade, we saw that it was reality shows and event television that was most popular, the most watched, and that like televised, like dramatized TV shows and sitcoms were kind of barely cracking into the top 5. But then, of course, the major, I guess you would say, revolution of this decade when it came to TV was the advent of streaming services. The fact that TV shows were being produced for services that were not something you could find on your television, and that it promised the ability to watch a whole season at once. You didn't have to wait week to week, and that you could pause it and go at your own pace. You didn't have to show up at a certain specific time and place to watch your show. So these top 5 shows we're going to mention here, these are shows that essentially very regularly showed up in our lists of popular most watched shows. And it got to the point where towards, again, the middle of the decade, we had to start looking at top streaming shows as well, because what was what was popular just on TV ratings was not entirely evocative of what was actually being watched. So I put The Walking Dead on here among the most watched TV shows because it did make the top, like the most watched list at least 3 times. And, for a while, it was really one of the most watched, most popular, most talked about TV shows.
Yeah, and I mean, The Walking Dead was. I think there's a lot of there aren't, well, there are some shows, and I think this one really was the show that was on the cusp of like the switch between kind of network television and streaming services, right? Because like there are a few other shows in the decade like Breaking Bad and things that were kind of ending, but I feel like The Walking Dead was still kind of in its heydays while this transition was happening, and somehow managed to more or less survive it. So it's a good show to look back on, but definitely, unfortunately, a show that kind of hit problematics as it evolved. But that's not really. I don't think it necessarily had to do with the transition so much as with the show itself.
Yeah, I have it on good authority from someone who watches this show still that it's actually like bouncing back and it's getting better. I know it definitely hit a lull there. So based on that information, I'm going to give The Walking Dead overall a back cookie.
All right. Yeah, I think I can second that. It was a good show and I enjoyed it.
Orange is the New Black is a Netflix show that was from the time we started tracking most watched shows on streaming. Orange is the New Black was on the top, and basically every year we talked about it, it was there in the top 5 somewhere. It definitely like decreased in popularity as the decade went on towards the end, but among all the streaming shows, it seemed to continually be there as the one that was most watched by people. So
Yeah, I still, again, still don't quite understand how it did that well. Maybe I should watch some of it, but I don't really have a desire for it. I think, but yeah, on virtue of that, maybe a thin station bat cookie because it held on, but also perhaps because being so popular, it probably did kind of have an instrumental role in making streaming services more popular. So I can
yeah,
give it a thin station bat cookie for that.
I'll agree. Thin station bat cookie. The Big Bang Theory was a show that was not even in the top 5 at the start of the decade, and then it kind of like hit a point where it was in the top 5, and then it came to the top, got to number 1 year, and then it fell back to like second and third towards the end of the decade when the show completed. So Big Bang Theory is certainly it was one of the most prolific shows of the decade. It popularized nerd and geek culture in a lot of ways, and it made a lot of improvements over its initial concept, which both of us have spoken ill of before. So the fact that it kind of like learned to pivot and evolve as a show, and that obviously helped it grow its popularity. I fell off the bandwagon. I stopped watching it regularly, but knowing seeing how it ended because I watched the finale, I can't help but give The Big Bang Theory a bat cookie.
Yeah, I think definitely. Again, I didn't. I liked it a little bit in the first season, then disliked it in the second, and then started rewatching parts of it. I think overall it still deserves a bat cookie. There were a few years where it didn't do great, but yeah, the show did change itself and became a very, kind of a powerhouse and ended up being a well developed show. So bat cookie.
And in number 2, I put football. Sunday Night Football
Just
was in.
football.
Yeah, Sunday Night Football, the National Football League, was on the list of most watched shows every year. It's undeniable that Americans love watching football on television, even though it's only on for like 4 months of the year, maybe 5 months. I'm not super sure, but all I have to say, like there still is a place for event television, like American Idol and Dancing with the Stars. Like those were shows that were on at the start of the decade that were really popular because they were able to draw a crowd. But I think in the advent of streaming services, those kind of shows aren't as popular. But something like football, it's like you got to be there. That's when the game is. That's when they're playing the game. So it kind of like found its footing, and it works.
Yeah, I think. I mean, yeah, it's true that that is kind of the place that football has. I would give it a bat noogie though because I don't like football personally, and because I don't know. The idea of event television, I think, is still diminishing, and who knows where it'll be in a few more years with streaming services starting to be a thing for sports. So, I think I'm still good with giving it a bat noogie.
Yeah, I don't like football. Like it's I like watching sports, but football is not the sport I would watch by default. So, having said all that, I will give it a two knuckle bat nuggie. And I think the TV show that we can agree on is the most prolific of the last decade is NCIS.
NCIS has discovered the remains of an unidentified JAG lieutenant in Potomac Park.
Hey, she's a JAG. And how many blonde JAG female lieutenants can there be?
Special Agents Gibson and Blackadder of NCIS, they'll be investigating the death.
You seem to know it better than anyone else. Why don't we start with you?
What went on between you and Lieutenant Singer?
Nothing, sir.
Nothing, my ass. After that performance in the conference room, you'd be my prime suspect.
When she died. You get your head around this murder case. Am I clear?
Very, sir.
Yeah, I don't like it, but I can't deny that it and its spin-offs were consistently there. So, yeah, that I'm going to give it a bat cookie just on the sheer accomplishment it has, not because I have any interest in watching it or think it's necessarily good.
Yeah, you made the really good point one week that it's impressive that NCIS, which is now in I think it's like 15th season, if not more than that a TV show was able to remain popular year after year, as opposed to like some of these franchises that are video games or movies where they can kind of do something different year after year. With this, it's like it's still the same show, and I guess it really says something about like the core cast of characters this show has, where people just keep coming back to watch it, and I'm flabbergasted. I honestly, when we started this, I did not think I'd be talking so much about NCIS, but here we are. I think we can say, yeah, well done, NCIS, Bat Cookie. Um,
But you're happy
maybe I'll
about
end up.
having it done so.
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah. All right, going through our favorite shows of the decade, BPR. What do you got?
Okay. So I was surprised. Like, I don't know. There were a lot of. I tried to limit to myself. I guess I was going through the list. There weren't as many shows as I thought there would be. Even though I watched a lot of TV, I realized a lot of it was because of Netflix. I ended up watching shows that I didn't watch when I was younger. So I put number one as not the one I enjoyed the most because but yeah, I put Gravity Falls because I really enjoyed that show, even though I watched it literally in the last year of the decade. Um, it was short, and the more I'm watching, the more I watch TV shows, especially American TV shows, the more I realize that there is something about the anime fan in me that likes shows that have a concrete story to tell. And Gravity Falls, it was only 2 seasons because it had a story to tell. It told it, and then it ended. And I think that that's something that's really cool, and that I prefer over TV shows that might have some overarching storylines, but really is about being more episodic. And I don't like that as much, which is why I put Gravity Falls up there. It was yes, they were episodes, but they were all in small ways building towards something, which was kind of a greater thing. And sorry, yeah, it had an end goal in mind, and it went and it did it.
I had to put Arrow on the list because not just for Arrow itself, which by this point, hopefully, I've watched the series finale of Arrow. It came out while Exodus 90 was going on, but hopefully, I've watched it by this point. Arrow itself, I watched it all the way through. I really enjoyed it. There were parts where it wasn't as good, and I'll admit to that. But the fact that the Arrowverse, all the shows that came out of this, really was the bulk of my TV time this decade. Like I was trying to follow 3, 4, sometimes 5 shows at once, and the fact that they were all loosely connected to each other and that there was a crossover every year, um, it got me really excited for this kind of television, and seeing some obscure DC characters I'd never heard of before on television was awesome. So yeah, I had no choice but to put Arrow on here.
Yeah, fair enough. The next one I put was Stranger Things. Um, it's not very often that I find a show that I enjoy as much as I enjoyed Stranger Things, especially one that I'd never heard of anything about, and then suddenly it was like, yeah, this thing exists. And I watched it, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. I really, really enjoyed it. I definitely went less on my TV shows about things that I think had large scale influence because I've discovered once again that things on TV I cared less about. Um, and I'm actually going to change one of the ones on my list for the next one because you already put it, and I think you're going to talk about it anyway, and probably better than me.
Well, I put Daredevil on my list because, again, if I wasn't watching the Arrowverse, I was watching the Marvel Netflix shows, and among them, Daredevil, like I would say, unlike the Arrowverse, Daredevil is the clear winner of best show of the Marvel Netflix shows, and it had a really good story to tell over 3 seasons. Matt Murdock and company went on a great adventure. If it comes back somehow through Disney Plus or Hulu, that would be great because I really want to see these specific characters interact with other parts of the MCU as a whole. It was a really great take on the character, much better than the movie.
Yeah. So my next one I'm going to talk about is Better Call Saul because I don't know. I realized that again. I watched a lot of TV in the last few years, but like I watched the entirety of Two and a Half Men, I think, and then I watched a bunch of like I basically watch a lot of older TV, and I'm slowly catching up. So maybe I'll get to the TV shows of this decade eventually in my life. But Better Call Saul I put there because I did watch Breaking Bad and then did not was not impressed. And Better Call Saul, I think, was something that was great. Um, that worked as a spin-off, but also that showed off, the fact that, like you said, maybe Daredevil will be picked up again. Better Call Saul is a spin-off of an AMC show.
No, that's right.
Yeah, it is.
AMC.
It is an AMC show, but it was picked up by Netflix, and Netflix is the one producing it. It did a kind of a similar thing with the last season of Arrested Development, except that was kind of a disaster. Well, that wasn't quite as good, so I didn't want to talk about that, but I think it is kind of showing that some shows that we thought might die aren't dying anymore. That fan input is being respected and being taken into consideration more, which I think is really cool. And so that's why Better Call Saul is there. Also, I really enjoy the show.
So the show we both had on our list initially was Brooklyn Nine-Nine. This for me is just a show that lived up to the hype because I didn't watch it for like the first 4 years it was on, but people in my life watched it and they'd quote it and they'd talk about it, and I'm like, okay, I get it, the show's good, blah blah blah. And then finally I like sat down to watch it from the beginning, and very rarely does this happen, but something actually lived up to the hype and I actually got really into it, and I can't wait for the next season to be available on Netflix.
Yeah, um, I agree. Um, and I kind of figured there wasn't much more to say about it than that. So I put the next one I put is The Mandalorian, even though it only came out in the last year, and I was hesitating to put it there because of that. But it is the best thing that's come out of the Disney buying Star Wars and Lucasfilm. So, um, and in my opinion, by no small margin. Although I guess Rebels did start after Disney bought, right?
Yes, but
Yeah.
I'll agree with you. I think
But
Mandalorian's that
I
good.
still think Mandalorian is better than Rebels. Maybe not by as much as it is better than the movies that have been done under Disney. But the Mandalorian was great. Um, and it's yeah, it was what got Disney Plus going, which I'm enjoying more and more the longer it's been on. Realizing a lot of my childhood movies are in on it as well. Um, and yeah, it's gotten me started to watch other things. And yeah, the fact that Disney owns Star Wars does mean that the original Star Wars movies are on Disney Plus too, which is also kind of good.
Fans of this podcast know I love the show Young Justice, so I had no choice but to include it among my favorite shows of the decade. I think it's an excellent take on DC Comics. I would recommend this show to anybody. If you don't like animated shows, then just get over yourself and watch it. The third season aired, like it was canceled for many years, and it got revived through the DC streaming service. And I bought the Blu-ray for season 3. I look forward to watching it soon. It's yeah, it's awesome.
I like it. And the last one I put was Adventure Time. Uh, I don't remember when it ended. It was only 8 seasons, so it might have started in this decade. I just really love that show so much. I can't really explain why. I think it's a combination of the world building that was done very well, and kind of like the fact that they remembered details from like several seasons before and still came to fruition, whether it was planned from the beginning or not. I just always remember in the first time Marceline's dad is introduced and he talks to Gunther the Penguin. Is like, "You are the most evil thing I've ever met," and you're like, "Haha, that's funny. The Penguin is evil." But then several seasons later, slight spoiler, I guess, but the show's kind of over. He actually was the reincarnation, well, the compressed version of an evil entity called Orgolog, and it was like, haha, this is cool. So I really like it's cheerful and it's cute, and I guess kind of like you said, Arrow is the one show you followed. I did actually follow Adventure Time. In its entire like there was a little delay on me watching the last season, but I did watch it through and I really enjoyed it. So yeah, that's my last one.
And then my final TV show is The Dragon Prince, because this is a show that I've been enjoying on Netflix, watching with my roommate. And even though it's designed for kids, it has a really great world. Like they take full episodes to kind of explain the lore and the history of it. You can tell that effort has been put into making the show, and that they weren't just trying to like make some dumb show for kids. Um, it does a good job of like connecting with my heart. It's like like it's when something happens to the characters, I actually care, and I feel like any show that can do that is a good show. So well done, Dragon Prince.
Yeah, I mean, I I kind of was thinking about watching it before, and now you kind of convinced me. So yeah, TV shows. I think we've talked about the movement towards online platforms enough. I realized personally I didn't watch that many new TV shows, but I'm kind of okay with it.
Yeah. So moving on now to anime of the last decade. The metrics by which we were tracking like best anime of the decade kind of changed a couple times, but for simplicity's sake, I included every anime that showed up in our top list at least 3 times, and there's 7 titles that fit into that category. So we'll kind of talk about them very briefly here. Some of them we won't have much to say. So, like for example, we have Haikyuu, the volleyball anime, was in the top list 3 times.
Go teamwork.
I'll give it a thin station back cookie.
Yeah.
Kuroko's basketball,
Superpowers in
another
basketball.
yeah, another 3 years in the top list. I never got into it, so I will bet. I think I'll concede. I'll give it a thin station back cookie.
I'm giving it a sensation bet cookie based on the abridged series being hilarious.
Gintama was in the top. It was like the top rated show for 2 years we talked about, and it was in the top 5 for another. So I've never really gotten into this show,
This
but I
show
know
is
you.
still underrated, in my opinion, even though it made it on those lists. It needs to have more of a fan base.
So it sounds like you want to give it a back cookie.
I definitely give Gintama a big old back cookie.
But you know what? To be fair, I think it does say something about the quality of Gintama that it did, because most of those lists were based on like user rankings. So those are like anime fans like yourself who acknowledge the quality of Gintama that kept putting it into that list. So it's definitely like it's getting its praise, but not enough praise. The Monogatari series, to my annoyance, kept popping up in the top list. It was like the number 1 show at least twice. I've spoken before how I've tried watching this show, and it has a lot of anime cliches and quirks that I just don't enjoy. There's other shows that came out this decade that kind of do this whole supernatural mystery thing, I think, better. I really would have a hard time recommending this to anybody. So it gets a bad noogie for me personally.
Yeah, I give it a bat noogie as well.
The one show that kept popping up that neither of us had anything to say about was Natsume's Book of Friends. It showed up in the top 5 list at least 3 times with different seasons, and it had at least 5 seasons that I'm aware of. So
Oh,
I I don't know what else to say about it. We determined it's a shoujo show, so obviously that means like its target audience is female. So we're not in the target audience, so maybe it makes sense that we don't connect with it.
yeah. Let's give it a sensation bat cookie, and somebody can correct us on it if they really love it.
And then JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, it was in the list at least 3 times for different seasons. So, and I know this is a favorite of yours. So, maybe just remind people of like why it would have been showing up every year.
Um, I mean, I think if I'm not mistaken, it was the first year it came out where people were just super excited that JoJo's was getting an anime adaptation because it hadn't. Like it had gotten in a couple of OVAs in the 90s, but the manga has been ongoing since the 80s. So I think that's what it was. There was kind of this dormant fan base for JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, the manga, and then suddenly it got an anime, and people started really loving it, and it kind of made it into the mainstream and kind of stayed there, at least to some extent. And then that's kind of then I'm guessing that would fit. That would be the first season, and then the second season did well, but then uh, the third part, which is season 3 and 4, um, Stardust Crusade and Battle for Egypt are generally regarded as being the best parts of both the manga and I guess the anime now too. So it makes sense they got popular. I have heard people make compelling arguments for why Part 4 is objectively better. I don't know if I necessarily agree, but it's great because like it kind of the show completely reinvents itself for the first 3 seasons and then partially reinvents and revamps its setting every season after that with new main characters and with new supporting cast, but the same universe. And I think it's really worth looking into as like a building up of different stories and just generally being really fun and having one of the best battle systems in anime. But we could talk about that for a long time.
Yeah, based on your enthusiasm, I'll give it a bat cookie.
Yes, that cookie for sure.
And My Hero Academia, basically every year it had a season, which it's had 4 seasons in the last 4 years. It, no matter what kind of list we were looking at, it continually showed up there in the most popular list.
Sometimes I do feel like I'm a failure. Like there's no hope for me.
Someone's gotta teach that worthless nerd how the world really works.
But even so, I'm not gonna give up.
You're even worse than the rest of these damn rejects, you quirkless wannabe!
Is it possible to become a hero even if I don't have a quirk?
Opportunity. A chance to shine. To show what you're really made of.
And I know you've given your critiques about the show, and I would agree. It has a large ensemble cast, and as the show went on, it focuses on fewer and fewer characters. So a lot of the background characters just feel like wasted space. And I don't know, because I don't read the manga, like if it continues with that trend. But where it's sitting right now, as for me, as a guy who is already inclined to enjoy a show about superheroes, I really enjoy the way in which they portray the you just can't help but feel good that all these young people have these aspirations to be heroes, not because they want, well, some of them want to be famous, but most of them just have this like genuine desire to help others, and they want to be able to protect others. You just can't help but feel good about the world when you see like young people really stepping up for good, and especially in this case where they all have superpowers. They, there's no they're not legally obliged to be superheroes, but they're choosing to go through the training and the formation to get to that place.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I think it got overhyped for me, and then I watched it slash read it, and I was like, yeah, this is good, but not amazing. And I'm not as big a superhero fan as you are. And I think I've spoken quite a bit about like other shows I think do things better than it does, but I can still acknowledge it's been really good, and I mean it's currently kind of the biggest thing happening other than One Piece, which is still happening. So yeah, I'll go give it a bat cookie.
Bat cookie. And then talking about our personal favorites in the decade, uh, I spoke about Recreators in our 2017 episode, and you kind of helped like shut it down as a show that wouldn't be good for non-anime fans to enjoy. And upon reflection, you were right. You really you could watch Recreators and enjoy it if you don't watch anime, because there still is a lot of philosophical arguments about like relationships with a creator, and what does it mean to be alive, and what does it matter if I have a purpose or a destiny. Like there's a lot of those kind of questions which are portrayed really well. But a lot of what makes the show really interesting is if you understand the anime industry. So to your point, yes, it's not for newcomers, but anyone who is into anime should check out Recreators.
Fair enough. And I think when I talked about Gintama, there is definitely more of an appeal for people who have watched anime, but I still think it's quite good. The number one I put it as my number one is the 2011 Hunter x Hunter anime. It's amazing. Um, it is quickly becoming. Well, I think it's pretty much lodged as my second favorite series of all time after One Piece. It's 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 a great series. It has a lot of energy. The opening theme is a bop, and like it's different lyrics to the same song for throughout the entirety of its run. It's a great manga series if you want to check it out too. It ended at a time which was a good kind of place to end it, given where the plot, well, health issues with the author and where the plot is at. But I just uh, the animation is on par. Everything about it works and works well, and everything about the storytelling, it just keeps getting better. And the last two arcs in it are just so amazing. I can't. Yeah, I just love that show a lot. I'm in the process of rewatching it for like the third time right now with my fiance and her roommates. Like we all enjoy it, and it was an accident that we started watching it together, and now it's like become kind of a tradition for us. So like, yeah, it's a great show. I love it.
I put Log Horizon on my list.
Mm.
When it came up, we talked about it as basically the better version of Sword Art Online.
Yep.
And I've recently discovered that it's getting a third season this fall, so that just gives even more reason for people to check it out, because before it kind of ended in a, well, what happens next sort of thing. But now we know there's going to be a third season, so even more reason to check it out.
I know I talked about it already, and it was on the list. I tried to vary things for these lists, but for this one, I love JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It's been out of all the new shows that I've watched in the last decades for anime, it's been my favorite. Um, I'm putting like I don't really consider Hunter x Hunter to be a new show because there were like two other series before it. Although I guess maybe JoJo's shouldn't count either. I don't know. If not, then it's right underneath Hunter x Hunter. It's a great show, and I think it really, if you have watched other shows, it informs where some of the things come from. Even like the power system in Hunter x Hunter does borrow kind of aspects from it, in it being both like kind of physical but also mental in the way that people have to battle each other. And I think um, it did a really good job at like setting up good stakes for it. So yeah, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, I like it.
I put The Rising of the Shield Hero on my list of my personal favorite anime from the last decade, because even though it is an isekai trapped in another world anime, which was a huge trend this decade, I just really enjoyed the tenacity and the perseverance of the main character. He faces so much opposition and so much unnecessary hatred that, in spite of all that, he continued to try and pursue doing the right thing. And I just really enjoy protagonists like that. Like, that's why Spider-Man is one of my favorite comic book characters, because in spite of all the obstacles and the challenges, he pushes forward. And now Fumi, who is the main character of the Shield Hero, he is very much of that same ilk. He pushes forward even when everything seems like it's hard.
The next one I put was Gintama. Again, it's this one's existed for a while, and I'm kind of sad I didn't discover it earlier. But it's a great show. It has an amazing protagonist. Doesn't always make a lot of sense, but in a good way. I mean, when you have a protagonist that can both convince you that bedwetting is the greatest experience ever, and that one of the manliest things in the world to drink is strawberry milk, which is one of the reasons I drink strawberry milk. I don't know what else to tell you. If this sounds great to you, watch it. If it doesn't, well, you know, watch it anyways and make up your own mind, because out of context it sounds stupid.
I included Your Lie in April on my list of best anime of the decade because, for me, this symbolizes at least my formation as an anime fan and getting into subtitled anime and following shows week to week on Crunchyroll, because this was a show I watched on Crunchyroll, and every episode ends one week and I was left dying to find out what happened next. And it's a dramatic show. It's got parts that make you cry, and it's sad, but it's beautiful at the same time. And it's about music, which is something that I've never been good at, but I'm starting to grow in my appreciation for. So I gotta love it.
I put Space Dandy next because, well, I love the show. It's great and hilarious, but also we talked about it as being kind of the first simul dub, so it's more there because of that idea that in this decade, anime has hit a point where there's enough of a demand to have dubs and subs created more or less simultaneously with the Japanese release. Like this is no longer really something that you have to wait for it to become popular in Japan, then bring it to America, and then it might become popular. It has become an industry that caters to kind of, the North American public to a certain extent at least, and that you can be an anime fan without being kind of a weirdo who is you know, uh, who just is obsessed with Japan and Japanese culture. It is really become accessible to everybody, and I think Space Dandy and Simul Dubs kind of started that. Also, Space Dandy is just I I laugh at every episode. It's so ridiculous, and has, you know, yeah, vibes of both being kind of hippie and funny and also irreverently so. So I like it.
And I included Your Name on the list of anime of the decade. It's a really great movie, and it was one of the few examples in the last decade of like an anime film really getting a lot of attention in the wider kind of pop culture scene. It didn't quite get the Oscar buzz it deserved, but I'm over that more or less. Because it did get a release here. It did do well. I have it on Blu-ray. I think it's a really great movie.
To be fair, I almost put uh, the Broly movie for to talk about Dragon Ball Super, but in the end, I put One Piece because One Piece is king. It's still ongoing. It's still going strong. This decade has seen some of the better arcs. The Dressora arc came out, which is when Dofi finally comes in as the main villain. That was amazing. I loved it. Um, most of what I've done for watching the show has happened this decade, and it's honestly probably the show that has had the biggest influence on me as an anime fan. But even just I have grown to love these characters so much, and whenever people talk to me about TV shows or anything, like One Piece is the one I can talk the most about, both because of the details, but also just because I think it is a great example of a single man's accomplishment, as well as like how great character building, great world building, and great storytelling all go together perfectly, and great visual telling as well. One Piece is king.
And finally, talking about movies from the last decade. Yeah, for this one, I basically just pulled like the top 5 grossing films
Fair enough.
because as we look towards the start of the decade, a lot of movies like Twilight and Hunger Games, like this craze of like young adult novel adaptations were popular and doing well financially, but not nearly as well as movies that were being released towards the end of the decade. So you would think that as streaming services became more popular and it was easier to watch movies at home, people would stop going to the movie theater. But what we actually saw is that as the decade went on, movies ended up grossing more and more money because there seemed to be movies that were being made that just had large appeal. And I think the movies that we list here kind of like speak to different trends of the decade. Um, but just to kind of briefly mention some movies that we talked about a lot that didn't get show up in here. For one, I mentioned Twilight and The Hunger Games. Young adult novel adaptations did really well this decade, but they never really reached the success of some of these other films. And of course, the Disney live actions had a lot of movies come out this year. Some of them did really well. Some of them, Alice in Wonderland 2, did not do very well. Neither did Dumbo, actually, now that I think about it. But they didn't quite, even though some of them did really well financially, they didn't quite crack this top 5 here. So in 5th, we have Jurassic World, which I think is kind of representative of this general trend of the decade of trying to bring back things that were working in movies previously. Like we saw a lot of movies come out this decade which were either reboots of movies from an earlier point in history, or in the case of Jurassic World, a kind of spin-off, a loose continuation of a movie series that was really popular in the past.
And I think that, but I think also it kind of saw a revival of kind of sci-fi fantasy ish things, like not as much like Lord of the Rings did for fantasy, and some of the science fiction like Star Trek didn't do as well as Star Wars, but it is kind of returned to uh, bigger movies as well. Like, well, we'll look at the list. Other than, two of them are not so big, but the rest of them are like, I mean, they were all big in different ways. So let's just
So I did not watch Jurassic World in theaters. I saw it on an airplane about 2 years after it came out, and I found it underwhelming. So I'll give it a 2-knuckle bat noogie.
I will go with I go with a sensation back cookie. I think that it did well enough, and it did do some good things for Chris Pratt coming out as popular in it, and I think that's something that was good. So, sensation bat cookie for me.
Number 4, Avengers: Infinity War. Now, this is a movie that only really worked because it was building off of the success of so many other movies. If they had not done Civil War, Thor Ragnarok, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Black Panther, and even Doctor Strange, Infinity War would have been a complete mess of a film.
Yeah, I think Um, and I think also, like, again, I was talking about big films like that one. It did rely on a lot of them, but what I think it also is something that we can speak about, Marvel movies at large, which, most of them, the MCU was built in the decade, was that it wasn't built directly towards Infinity Wars and Endgame, right? They were good movies and they started making it like, okay, well, this is in the same universe. And then, the first Avengers, they tried it, they put things together and it worked. And, as much as like I disliked Age of Ultron, I can still acknowledge that it was a setup for greater things. But it's only, after they had successful franchises that they started doing that setup, which I think also speaks to like a lot of people who have since tried making like movie franchise like the monster movies were supposed to have their own universe and that didn't really work out. DC tried to have their own cinematic universe and that didn't really work out. And so I think Infinity Wars, I mean, as well as Endgame, are the culmination of kind of a slow, well-built process as opposed to trying to rush to an end result. And I think we kind of need to appreciate for that.
Yeah, because like imagine if they tried to make Infinity War without having made Doctor Strange in his own movie, or without making Black Panther in his own movie, or without having had Thor Ragnarok, or even Guardians of the Galaxy introduce Thanos and have those like if you were just trying to like because Infinity War feels like a Marvel comic. The fact that there's all these characters there who occupy the same world and they're interacting with each other, that's very much like a Marvel comic you just pick up off the newsstands now. But if that was like someone's first introduction to all these characters, it would just come off as this huge convoluted mess. Because a lot of those characters are introduced in the movie without really an explanation of who they are, because we're operating to the assumption you've already seen the other movies, you already know who they are. There's no need to have to spend time on that. We can just go straight into the story.
Yeah, and it definitely did work out for that. So bat cookie for it.
Bad cookie. Black Panther number 3. I mean, granted, he did get his kind of like introduction in Civil War, and his moments in Civil War are like top notch. I knew from the trailer that they were like gonna have to like try and get us excited about a Black Panther movie, which is a character I'd heard of before but never really cared for personally. But the way Chadwick Boseman played him in Civil War, I was very intrigued with what his solo movie was going to be about. And as we spoke of when we talked about Black Panther, there was this kind of massive audience of African American moviegoers that just sort of showed up for this specific film and helped it do very well. And it got really good publicity. But I think we can both agree that even with hindsight of a couple years, it's not as good as it was built up to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, it. I'm not enough to go to give it a bat noogie outright, especially because some of the accomplishments we were talking about. But I do think that, um, yeah, it was a little bit overrated for what it was, but it did well, and it's still a solid enough movie that it deserves a bat cookie.
Yeah, and I'll also like I think Black Panther kind of represents a theme of taking risks. Marvel did this a couple times with Guardians of the Galaxy and Ant-Man, and certainly with Black Panther, of taking an idea that's like, well, who knows if this will work, but we're going to try it anyway. And there are a couple other examples outside of the MCU where that kind of risky filmmaking worked in this past decade, but certainly I think Black Panther is probably a good example of that. So yeah, I'll give it a bat cookie as well.
Yeah.
Number 2, Avengers Endgame. So in the same way that Infinity War's success comes from all the movies that came before it, of course, the way that Infinity War ends, where the villain has won and there's this huge, essentially, cliffhanger asking what's going to happen to all the characters, Endgame success really comes from the fact that it's building off of the rest of the MCU. And I said when we talked about Endgame last week that it's not as good a movie as Infinity War. It has less replay value, but as a finale, as like a closing chapter, I don't think there's anything to compare it to. Like Harry Potter was a franchise that went on for 10 years, but I don't think you'd find anyone who would say that the final Harry Potter movie was a better conclusion than Endgame was.
No, I don't think so either. And even though I haven't seen it, that's basically what people were saying about it. And other than that, I think we talked about the important things about it for Infinity Wars. So let's move on to the last one.
Yeah, so Bat Cookie for Endgame.
Oh yes, Bad Cookie still, yeah.
And so this is a technicality. Although Avengers Endgame is the highest grossing film of all time worldwide, domestically, to this day, the highest grossing film of all time is Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens.
Who are you? I'm no one. Follow me.
Nothing will stand in our way. I'll show them the dark side.
I don't know your name.
Finn, what's yours?
I'm Ray.
You might need this.
Star Wars: The Force Awakens.
And again, as much as like we've bragged a lot about the other two, and there are some aspects of that movie that I very much dislike, it could have been a setup to great things, right? Like, had they stuck with one vision and had the trilogy gone in the direction it seemed to be pointing towards at the beginning, or after The Force Awakens, it was still redeemable in a sense. I definitely think that in hindsight, people are gonna look back on it and be like, "Oh yeah, what were we thinking?" But I mean, but also it was exciting. It was the new Star Wars movie. Hadn't been one for a long time. It was under the direction of J.J. Abrams, and people were very excited about that too. Like, there was a lot of hype build up around it, and people were still kind of giving it the benefit of the doubt. Which I think by the time it got to Rise of Skywalker, it was like, why are we still bothering with these?
Yeah, I think the promise of a return to something more like the original trilogy, and certainly the inclusion of the characters and the actors from the original trilogy, kind of brought back a lot of initial interest from people who maybe were turned off Star Wars by the prequels. And Episode 7 is criticized because it is essentially a remake of A New Hope in a lot of ways. And for some Star Wars fans, that it didn't, they liked that because it reminded them of the Star Wars movies they liked. And then other fans didn't like it because it's like, well, give me something different. Don't just copy your other movies. So it started to really show how it's impossible to please all Star Wars fans. And you're right that basically every Disney Star Wars film that came after this uh, was controversial for different reasons. And although I think Rogue One personally is the best of the Disney Star Wars movies, you can't argue with the financial success of The Force Awakens. So I'll still give it a Bat Cookie.
I'll give it a sensation Bad Cookie. It wasn't trying to be bad.
And then let's just talk about some of our favorite movies of the decade. I put Dawn of the Planet of the Apes on my list of films because I remember going to see that movie in 2014 with no great expectations, having not seen the first one that it was like a sequel to, and just being blown away by like the quality of the storytelling, the brilliant motion capture performances by Andy Serkis and company, and just how impressive the visual effects were. I was like, these gorillas or these apes or whatever they are, they look real. And I'm captivated by this story, even though I didn't know anything about this before I started watching this movie.
Yeah. Before I talk about mine, I had put the Planet of the Apes prequel trilogy as like if I had an honorable mention, it would have been up there. But there were other movies I wanted to talk about. I put Scott Pilgrim versus the World because I needed to put at least either that or Baby Driver. I enjoyed both of them, and I love Edgar Wright as a director. But then I realized I just like Scott Pilgrim better. It's a movie I can put in any day, any time, and just be like, yes, I like this. This is a good movie. Whereas Baby Driver, there's a bit more of like having to be in the mood for the musical experience that it is. Yeah, I I really hope that you know we get to see more of Edgar Wright in Hollywood, even though he was supposed to direct Ant Man. But let's not get too bitter about that.
I put Blade Runner 2049 on my list because I feel like this is a movie that was sadly underrated. It was a sequel to a movie from like 35 years prior, so it certainly was like a very late in the game sequel. But it had this great neo noir perspective. It did a lot of interesting stuff with AI and like what is real and what isn't, and in a lot of the ways that the first Blade Runner was revolutionary for its time. I think Blade Runner 2049 did a lot of the same things, but it just didn't find the same audience, and it deserves recognition. So I put on my list.
Um, yeah, the next one I put is Megamind. Again, I've rewatched that movie, and I feel a little bit bad that these are both movies that came out in the first year of the decade, so obviously I've had more of an opportunity to rewatch them. But they're among two of my favorite movies of all time, so I think I just needed to have them there to talk about them because I really like them. So I've rewatched them so many times. I think Megamind is just such a great story, and it was kind of one of the first movies where I realized that like kids movies didn't need to be just nostalgic in order to be good. And I think that's definitely opened up my mind and opened up my kind of movie viewing experience to a lot of other movies that I might have not seen if I hadn't enjoyed that one so much. So I put Megamind in there.
I put Knives Out on my list for a couple different reasons. First of all, the marketing for the movie was excellent. Even the poster that had like all the characters in like different colored outfits, it was like an excellent poster, very striking. And I think it's a great rebound for Ryan Johnson after having directed the controversial The Last Jedi to come back and do a movie to like prove it's like okay, like yeah, maybe he didn't do a good job with Star Wars, but this man is capable of doing good movies. And Knives Out is just like it's a really great whodunit mystery movie. It's got a good couple twists in there, and at one point you think you figured out what's going on, and then you're like, oh, I didn't see that coming. It's just a really well put together movie, a great ensemble cast, and you get to hear Chris Evans swear, which after hearing him play Captain America so much, it was just a fun deviation from what you normally expect from him.
I
So
like it. I still
yeah,
haven't seen it, but I am planning on watching it as soon as physically possible. I put Spider-Man into the Spider-Verse. I think I love animated movies. That's become quite obvious, and that definitely, even though it got Best Animated Picture, it deserved a lot more hype and a lot more success in the box office than it got. Um, so I kind of feel a need to put it up there because yeah, it was great. Anything to add since it's also on your list?
it is also on my list. I think it's the best Spider-Man movie that's ever been made. It's the best representation of the character. I think it's a really great inclusion of a lot of obscure versions of Spider-Man from the comics. I think the music choices are great. The father-son story is great. The portrayal of the different versions of Peter Parker are great. Like you said, the animation is spectacular. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the sequel.
Then I put Deadpool. Yeah, it was actually. I'll just talk about the last two, and then you can just because they are both there for similar reasons. It's Deadpool and Guardians of the Galaxy. Even though Deadpool isn't in the MCU, it's still a Marvel
Yet.
movie. Um, and they were both movies that kind of that revitalized me wanting to watch superhero movies. I think Deadpool specifically also, was great at pulling back what Deadpool should be and proving that an R-rated superhero movie can still be good and isn't strictly just about getting the R rating. Like it got it and it needed it in some ways, but like it wasn't all about like it was obviously there, but it was still a good movie that happened to be R rated as opposed to being like an R rated movie that is also about superheroes, which is, what I feel could have easily been the case for it. And Guardians of the Galaxy, I rewatched it literally 2 days ago. Still good, still love it. I'm counting both of them in here because I actually like the second one better, but both of them kind of were a breath of fresh air into the MCU. That even though Thor Ragnarok also kind of did that, I feel like they were offering something that the MCU didn't have, and that it's been trying to kind of get back in other movies, which I'm not sure how I feel about, but tonally it was a shift, and it still managed to introduce a lot of important aspects of things that came into Infinity Wars and Endgame.
And then again, any fan of this podcast will know I'm a huge fan of the movie Moana, so I had no choice. I had to include it in my top 5 movies of the decade because it was another film like Planet of the Apes. I really went into it not having high expectations, and my expectations were blown out of the water because the movie is so great, the music's great, the animation's great, the story is great. I've seen like 4 different people kind of like dive into the different metaphors that are represented by the storytelling, and I just really enjoyed Moana's kind of like optimism and her like kind of persistence as a character. Even having The Rock in there was fun, and even Alan Tudyk as a chicken. Like it's just a fantastic movie, and I hope they eventually make a sequel to it. So there we go. Hard to believe that is we've kind of spent all this time talking about different elements of the last decade of nerd and geek culture. It'll be interesting to see where good things go this decade because, of course, right off the hop at the start of the decade, we're living in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of movies that were supposed to be released are being delayed or canceled, and people are offering their services for free so people can access to video games and movies and anime like less expensively than before. So I hate to say it, but this COVID-19 pandemic is a great opportunity for you to catch up on the last decade. If anything we've talked about today or in the previous episodes of Memory Lane uh, have gotten you interested, maybe start watching one of these TV shows or pick up one of these video games or, watch one of these anime or watch one of these movies because who knows? Like, there are lots of things that I'm gonna go through all the notes and find all the things that I have not checked out yet that I should probably start checking out. So anyway, Beeper, do you have any final thoughts for the decade?
I think we kind of covered it in our other discussions. I'm excited about things to come. I know that, I guess maybe on a personal note, I know that I'm still catching up on things from the 90s and early 2000s just because I didn't watch a lot of TV as a kid. But yeah, I've definitely, while going through looking for what I want to put on this list, I'm like, oh yeah, this is something I should probably check out before too long. So, I think it'd be a good idea to just listen to these episodes, even if all you get out of it is, huh, that sounds a little interesting. It'll be at least one thing to distract yourself a bit more.
And with that, that brings us to the end of the Memory Lane series. Thank you all for coming along with us on this journey through the last decade of nerd and geek culture.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
Message us on Facebook or message us on Twitter at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast in whatever platform you listen to podcasts, including YouTube. Please give us a rating, write reviews for our shows, and share our posts on social media. This will help us to bring all people inside the Bat Jar.
Normally we would go into the Bat Jar and pull out what we're going to do next. Way back, I want to say it was at least 4 months ago now, someone pulled Dungeons and Dragons out of the Bat Jar, and I think we should give the people what they want. So our next episode will be about Dungeons and Dragons. It'll be a little hard for me because I've only been exposed to it so much, but I think it'll be a chance to bring in maybe some special guests who have spent more time playing Dungeons and Dragons than I have. So come back to the Batchar podcast next week when we talk about Dungeons and Dragons. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
And I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
Catch you on the flip side.
Start playing D&D. It's a 2020 year.